Start recording.
Good morning. I'm Alice Newland, President of the League of Women Voters of Manatee County. On behalf of the League, I welcome you to our presentation today on clean and accurate voter rolls and the ERIC system. This program is being recorded and will be available on our website. Any use of the recording other than individuals viewing it must get the permission of the League. At the end of the presentation, our speakers will be taking questions. Please put your questions in chat for Judy Kraling. And if you have a specific speaker that it's for, please put the speaker you would like to answer that question. The integrity of our elections is important to us, no matter what our background or political party. It is part of the maintaining the integrity of elections and the perception of fair elections is that our voter rolls are up to date, contain accurate information about the voters in our state, and are secure from any intervention. We know clean voter rolls and the perception of clean voter rolls is important to our democracy. We have seen the harm done by the belief that there is widespread double voting and voting by dead people. There are instances in the last election where a few individuals voted in two different locations, believing the lie of widespread voter fraud. Today's presentation is about the ERIC system, which can be part of the solution to both cost-effective maintenance of voter rolls and reinforcing the perception of fair elections. It is also an effective tool for voter outreach, as part of the agreement with member states is to reach out to citizens who have moved from other states with information on how to register to vote in the new state. States that have joined ERIC have seen increased voter registration rates and more accurate voting lists. The Electronic Registration Information System, ERIC, is a nonprofit, nonpartisan membership organization created and comprised of state election officials from around the United States. It was founded in 2012, and is funded and governed by states that choose to join. ERIC is the most effective tool available to help election officials maintain more accurate voter rolls and detect possible illegal voting. ERIC also helps states reach out potentially eligible voters, but not yet registered, with information on how to best vote. Florida joined ERIC in 2019 after Governor DeSantis signed bills to allow Secretary of State to enter into an agreement with the organization. Unfortunately, despite ERIC being a tool recognized by local elections officials as important to the accuracy of Florida's voter registration rolls, Florida's Secretary of State suddenly announced on March 23 that Florida would be leaving ERIC. Today's speakers are Shane Hamlin and Mike Bennett. Shane has served as the executive director of the ERIC since June 2017. He previously served 18 years in Washington state government, including 5 years with the Washington State Senate Republican Caucus, nearly 10 years with the Office of Secretary of State, and 3 years with the Office of Financial Management as budget assistant to the governor. Working with two secretaries, Shane served as the legislative liaison, deputy director of elections, and co-director of elections. He led Washington's contribution to building the ERIC system, and he served as the first chair of the ERIC Board of Directors. Shane holds an undergraduate degree from Eastern Washington University and a master's in public administration from the University of Washington. Mike Bennett has an MBA from Drake University in 1976. Mike's business experience is both as a national sales manager, but also as a successful and profitable business owner who sold the business in 1998. Elected to the state Senate in 2002 and reelected in 2004. He represented District 21, consisting of Manatee, Lee, and parts of Sarasota and Charlotte and DeSoto counties. Elected to Manatee County Supervisor of Elections in 2012, he's been reelected every 4 years since that time. Before we start, I'm going to briefly cover types of voter fraud, as well as look at what types of voter fraud we've had in Florida in the last 11 years. And I'll point out the types of fraud that ERIC can detect and what it cannot. I'm going to take a minute here to share my screen. And we will. Okay, these are the types of voter fraud that have been identified by the Heritage Foundation. So I've highlighted the ones that ERIC will actually catch. Impersonation at the polls. So you vote under the name of somebody who has died, somebody's moved away, or lost their vote. And then there's false registrations, a phony name, a fake address, someone that's died. ERIC will pick a number of these up. Duplicate voting. If you're registered in multiple locations and you vote more than once, ERIC will pick this up if they're a member state. So it will show that this person moved and actually remove them from the polls from where they moved from. I'm sorry. There's two sheets here. Then there's fraudulent use of absentee ballots. This is where someone either votes for somebody else's absentee ballot that's not their own, or in the number of cases of these duplicate voting, if they've voted fraudulently in Florida and an absentee ballot and also voted in another jurisdiction, they will be charged with fraudulent use of absentee ballots. Then there's buying votes. Then there's illegal assistance in the polls where somebody intimidates a voter. They go in and they vote for them. They go into the poll place with them when they're marked for, there's ineligible. We will see a number of ineligibles, particularly in context with somebody with felony convictions. So they are not eligible. They're not a US citizen. Then there's altering the vote count. This has happened where they actually have happened in Florida, where they went in and changed the vote count. And then there's ballot petition fraud, where there's a petition, say something to put on the ballot, and you sign for somebody else. So the Heritage Foundation also has a database, and they ask people to report things to it of voter fraud. So I pulled off basically a little over 10 years of data, because 2023 is not done. So I took it from 2013 to 23. There were 41 cases. That is 41 individual people that were charged. So if you look at the numbers of the cases I have here, the types of cases, some of them are double. So if, for instance, I've already given, when somebody is voting in two locations and they vote using a vote by mail ballot, they'll get charged with 2 offenses. So, and as you can see, most of these ineligible were the recent flurry of going after people that thought they could vote because of the new change in the law, change in the Constitution. But there's a number of ones where somebody votes for their dead wife or something like that. But basically, there were only 6 in the last 10 plus years in the state. In those cases, 5 of them were caught after the implementation of ERIC. only one case was caught prior to that in 2018. I have no information of what caused that. Was that because they believed people were voting double, or prior to that case, were there just no cases and recently they've decided? But the fact is that 5 were caught, and the only way without Eric to catch these duplicate voting situations is if somebody turns them in. So with that, and this presentation is not about voter fraud. This is about the ERIC system and keeping clean and accurate voter rolls and reaching out to new voters with it. So we will go on to Shane Hamlin, and I will stop the share and the ERIC system.
Hello, everyone. Can you hear me okay? Great. First, I just want to thank Alice for inviting me to share an overview of ERIC with all of you at the Manatee County League of Women Voters. And I'm glad to have Supervisor Bennett on here as well. Can you hear me okay? Sorry that I heard a, okay. I'm glad to have Supervisor Bennett on as well. I believe, I don't know how involved you were, Supervisor, in sort of implementing ERIC and using ERIC when we were, when Florida was a member for a few years, but I'm glad to have you on the call, and maybe you can add some additional commentary as I move through the presentation. Hopefully can you all see the screen? Great, okay. So as Alice said, I'm not going to focus on voter fraud. I'll touch on it a little bit, but I am primarily giving you an overview of ERIC. And as Alice said, Florida joined in 2019, really operationalized the membership, meaning started submitting data and receiving reports in 2020. Took a few months to get Florida on board, although it was one of the best, smoothest, most professional onboardings we've had of our members. And then received reports right up until March of 23, and you'll see some more on this. So our mission, and I think I'm going to repeat a little bit of what Alice said, but I think it's important to emphasize some of the points she made. Our mission is to help state and local election officials improve the accuracy of their voter rolls, register eligible citizens, reduce costs, and improve efficiencies across the voter process. And we believe ERIC is the most effective and comprehensive tool available to help officials maintain accurate voter rolls and detect cases of possible cases of illegal voting. So just some basic points that I'm going to make that I think are really critical in this time when there is a tremendous amount of mis and disinformation about ERIC swirling around the internet and driving, I think, honestly, a lot of the sort of politically motivated conversations and discussions, accusations about ERIC right now. And so I want to highlight 3 key points here in what I'm calling the basics. So first, ERIC is a public charity nonprofit membership organization founded in 2012, founded by 7 states, not by any other entity or any other individuals. We did receive help from Pew in the startup of that, and I'll highlight that again here. But really, it was these 7 states agreeing to take on the risk and burden and being the early adopters of launching ERIC. They are the founders. 4 of those states were led by Republicans, 3 led by Democrats. Those states were Washington, Nevada, Colorado, Maryland, Delaware, Virginia, and Utah. Participating states control ERIC. The chief election official appoints a member representative. That member representative serves on the board of directors. Only these individuals have a vote on the board. And for a long time, we did have non-voting board seats, but those positions were eliminated a few months ago in March. And now the board consists entirely and only of these individuals and myself, and I serve in a non-voting ex officio capacity. ERIC is funded by participating states. New members pay a one-time fee. All members pay annual dues. The members set their dues. We did receive, as I said, startup support from Pew, but no other funding sources were involved in propping ERIC up and getting it launched. So today we have 26 members. Texas is in the process of resigning, unfortunately. And we will still have 25 members after that, and still a few states that are led by Republicans. So why was ERIC created? So I think all of you've probably had conversations, being League of Women Voters chapter, and I think Alice alluded to them, that preventing voter fraud is important, but really underlying that is reducing the opportunities for fraud. But there's really a more fundamental reason, and that's just election officials have a duty under the law, under state and federal law, to maintain accurate voter rolls. It's important because that voter registration rolls are the foundation of our democracy. From voter registration flows precincting, balloting, the ballot styles that are offered to voters, the entire elections process basically flows from the voter registration rolls. So it's critical to maintain accurate rolls, but this is a challenge because every day voters move or die. Voters don't always remember to update their registration. Family members don't always remember to notify election officials when a loved one has passed away. So using 2021 data, you can see on the screen about 27 million people moved that year, or about 8.4% of the population. Pre-COVID rates were higher. About 3.46 million Americans died in 2021. These are big numbers. Even in the state of Florida, as you'll see, we identified tens of thousands of deceased voters in the short period that Florida was a member. And so maintaining accurate lists when 8 to 9% of the population is moving every year. It's higher in regions of the state of the country where mobility can exceed 10 to 12%, with 3+ million Americans dying. It is a challenge and it's real. And election officials need all available tools to help them address this. Underscoring this, in 2012, research that Pew conducted found that 1 in 8 voter registrations was no longer valid or was significantly inaccurate. There were more than 1 million deceased individuals listed as voters. Almost 3 million people had registrations in more than one state, and yet at the same time, over 50 million probably eligible U.S. citizens were not registered, nearly a quarter of the population. You've probably seen some of these numbers before. They've been reported on heavily. The Heritage Foundation uses them. Brennan Center uses them. The mainstream media uses them. These numbers are common and used across the spectrum to sort of highlight the challenges of voter registration list maintenance. So given all of these factors, ERIC was created to provide election officials with a more efficient and effective tool for updating voter records and removing ineligible voters. And the founding states, those 7 states, wanted to improve the ability to maintain accurate voter rolls while also providing access to voter registration for all eligible citizens. They wanted a balanced mission, a balanced accuracy in the voter rolls with access to voter registration information. Over time, the ERIC model grew in terms of its the recommendations and endorsements it got, and the understanding of how it works, and the benefits and value that it brings to election administration. And this slide simply summarizes four different points at time in which there was a significant recommendation. And I'm not just talking about media or local organizations or national organizations, advocacy organizations. Here, I'm just highlighting 4 endorsements. First, in 2014, from the Presidential Commission on Elections and Administration, recommending states participate in interstate data cross-check programs like ERIC, and also at that time, the cross-check system that was sort of managed and centralized out of Kansas. In 2016, the Government Accountability Office issued a report on election issues related to registering voters and administering elections, and they found through their work and their research that participation in ERIC did reduce costs and improve list maintenance. 2018, a big report from a committee at the National Academies of Sciences. They produced a report called "Securing the Vote: Protecting American Democracy." They explicitly endorsed membership in ERIC with the proper safeguards in place to ensure more accurate voter rolls. And then most recently in 2020, the Bipartisan Policy Center issued its report called a Logical Elections Policy Report and Recommendations from their task force, and it also recommended participation in ERIC. So with that sort of general overview of why ERIC was created, how we're funded, governed, and some recommendations, I'll jump into the reports. So we offer what we kind of consider three buckets of reports. We have the eligible but unregistered, which identifies individuals who appear to be eligible but are not registered, and I'll talk more about each of these. Then we've got a category of list maintenance reports, which are sort of the focus of this presentation in some ways, because we're talking about the integrity of the voter rolls as it relates to preventing or reducing the opportunities for fraud. And it's sort of Eric's main mission here, coupled again with that eligible but unregistered report. And these are the in-state updates. So these are individuals who've moved within state and haven't updated their voter reg yet. Cross-state movers, deceased voters, and in-state duplicate registrations. And I'll talk a little bit more about each of these. And then we have two optional reports. We are a certified provider of official change of address data from the United States Postal Service. And so that is an optional report. Many of our states do take it, but it is optional. And then we have what we call the voter participation report. And this report is fairly new to ERIC, created and adopted officially in 2018 after a pilot study. This report identifies cases of possible illegal voting, specifically cases of voting where it appears an individual voted in the same state twice, in more than one state at the same election, or cases where it appears someone voted on behalf of a deceased voter. This report is offered only after a federal general election. So how are these reports generated? So at least every 60 days, members must submit their voter registration and DMV data, the green and yellow boxes there. And in these data files, we get the full name, we get a mailing and residential address, dates of birth, driver's license and ID numbers, the last four of the social security number, and then something we call the last activity date. And this is a calculated field. This is something we help them calculate, and it tells us which record, which set, either the DMV file or the voter file, has information that might be more recent, and thus suggests that that file, that address in that file is more current than the address in the other file, for example, and it should be flagged and reported back to the election official. So for example, if the DMV file has an address that's different than the voter file and the last activity date is more recent, then that suggests that that voter has moved, updated their license, but did not update their voter file, and that voter will be included in the in-state update report. We also are a certified user of the Social Security's limited access death master file. This identifies deceased individuals, people who die outside the state as well as inside the state. It includes full name, the date of birth, the Social Security number, and the date of death. Couple of very important caveats with these data sets. First, in the voter file and in the DMV file, our members must exclude all confidential records. So if your state has a program to protect the addresses from public disclosure of individuals who might be victims of domestic violence or stalking, they should be excluded. And I believe Florida has such a program, and those records were excluded at the time and during the time of your membership. Records exclude party affiliation and racial data if it's recorded. These data points are unnecessary for what we do. We don't need them. Our members exclude them. So we do not know who's registered as a Democrat or Republican or an unaffiliated or independent, and we do not have racial or ethnic data on any individuals in any of the data sets we use. Our members also exclude known non-citizens for a couple of very important reasons. We do not check citizenship. That's not Eric's mission. That information is historically very challenging because it's not always accurate. It changes over time. It's unreliable. There have been multiple lawsuits in multiple states, I believe, including Florida, over efforts to try to use lists of non-citizens to scrub against the rolls in a sort of en masse way. So non-citizen data in the DMV file, we don't want it because we do not want to inadvertently include it in that eligible but unregistered report that I mentioned earlier and that I will talk about again. And it also, because it can change over time, it's not ideal in list maintenance from Eric's perspective in our reports. There are other ways perhaps to obtain that information, but again, it's just a challenging data set to scrub against voter rolls in an efficient way. And then very importantly, to protect the dates of birth, the social security number, the driver's license and ID number, our members apply what is called a cryptographic hash or cryptographic one-way hash on those data elements. And this process is described in detail on our website, but essentially they apply a software algorithm that we give all of our members. So they all use the same algorithm. They apply it to those data fields, those 3 points, and it converts those values to a string of unreadable characters. So it takes the date of birth of March 9th, 1974, for example, converts it to a string of about 40 plus letters and numbers. We can still compare it to see if it's the same date of birth because everyone's using the same algorithm, but it's not really legible to us as humans. It would just be a string of random characters to us. And this is the base level of how we protect those data. They apply that cryptographic hash before they send us the data. So we do not receive dates of birth, social security numbers, driver's license numbers in plain text. When they submit them to us, they're already hashed. And then we actually hash those same values again inside our secure data environment. So they are double hashed inside our environment. Despite what some are asserting, members must use the list maintenance reports to update their voter rolls to improve the accuracy of their voter rolls. From here, and I won't read all of this, but emphasized in the bold and underlined is very clearly the requirement that members must use the reports to initiate contact with the voters in order to correct an inaccuracy or obtain information sufficient to inactivate or update the voter's records, the voter record, excuse me. And they have to do this within 90 days. Now, we do not require members to request more than one report every year or 425 days. So we can and will be strengthening the requirements around how frequently members request reports. But once they do request a report, they must use it to update their voter records. So now I'll share some statistics for you, and we'll talk a little bit also specifically about Florida. So cumulative statistics for those list maintenance reports for Eric across our membership since 2013. We first offered these list maintenance reports in early 2014, but I'm going to start with 2013 at the end of the year because we were getting that work underway. Through June of this year, you can see in total that we've identified almost 40 million out-of-date voter records. And you can see the categories here in state movers, about 25.5 million individuals. And that's pretty consistent. This is the largest number because most people move within the state they live in. They don't move from one state to another. That little blue text there just, again, reminds you how that report is generated. So here, there's more recent activity in the DMV record. That's why the individual ends up on here. The address is different, and it was more recently reported to the DMV than the address on their voter file. The cross-state movers identifies people who move from one ERIC state to another, so from Florida to another state. These are individuals who have a voter registration or a driver's license record in another state, and those records are newer or more recent than the record in Florida. Deceased individuals, these are voters who appeared on that limited access death master file. In-state duplicates, these are duplicate voter registrations within the state. And this happens when people move from county to county or municipality to municipality, depending on who administers elections in the state. It happens most often with a sort of bottom-up system where the locals are in more direct control of the voter registration records. And so it's fairly common, not unusual, and we detect those, and then the state and locals can determine which is the appropriate record, keep that one, and get rid of the other one. So the requirements for these reports, and I alluded to these a little bit, but our members must request at a minimum one of these reports at least every 425 days. Strongly encouraged to request act on all 4 of these once a year. And I do think we will strengthen these requirements in the coming year. They must certify that contact was initiated with at least 95% of the individuals on this report, and they must do that within 90 days of receiving this report. In terms of what they do, they have to follow state and federal law. You are probably all familiar or at least heard of the National Voter Registration Act. I think most of us are familiar with it because it brought us the Motor Voter Program, but it also requires states to have a uniform, non-discriminatory program for maintaining accurate voter rolls. And so states must follow that law and any applicable state laws when acting on these list maintenance reports. And you can see some options listed there. Typically, it is a mailing If it comes back as undeliverable, then the state has some options. Usually they inactivate. They put that voter record on inactive status. Sometimes it's called suspended status in some states. But under federal law, inactive voters must remain on the rolls through 2 federal general elections before they can be removed. You can also seek a voluntary cancellation. This is most common with a cross-state mover, where the state might mail a voluntary cancellation notice to the voter in their new out-of-state address, asking them to cancel their old registration if they do not intend to vote or in that state anymore. And if they don't, of course, return that, then typically they're placed on inactive status, again, through 2 federal general elections. How did Florida use ERIC's list maintenance reports? Well, between September 2020, when they started receiving list maintenance reports, and March of 2023, ERIC provided 60 reports. Just a nice round number there. That's totally coincidental. These 60 reports included the deceased report, the in-state movers, the cross-state movers, and in-state duplicate registrations. This doesn't include their NCOA reports. In these 60 reports, ERIC identified for the state almost 4.6 million likely out-of-date records and deceased voters in less than 3 years. And of those list maintenance reports and how these records break down, we identified about 812,000 voters who had moved to another state. So these are Floridians who moved out of Florida during this 2.5-year period. 3.7 million voters who moved within the state and hadn't updated their voter registration at the DMV or in any other method available to them in this 2.5-year period. Almost 21,000 deceased voters, and about 32,000 voters with duplicate registrations. Now, in fairness and in understanding these data, an important caveat, most of each of these categories were identified in the first reports that ERIC provided the state of Florida, because they were the first time that these categories of inaccurate records were that ERIC provided this data. So these first round of reports are always the largest. I don't have the trend on here to show you sort of, in other words, what subsequent reports looked like, but in a state the size of Florida, they were always significant because you have so many individuals. So you always had a high number of in-state movers and cross-state movers. So looking at that eligible but unregistered report, we call that an EBU, eligible but unregistered. EBU is just a little less of a mouthful. Across the membership from 2012 to 2022, ERIC identified about 60 million individuals who appeared to be eligible but were not registered. These are individuals who are in the DMV file but do not have a corresponding voter registration record. The requirements for these: every 2 years, the member must request this report and act on it prior to the federal general election. Act on it means that they typically mail a postcard out that clearly identifies the eligibility requirements, as you can see in that last bullet. A couple of very important caveats on these. These reports contain data that comes from the DMV, only from the DMV. There's no other data source in here. Again, there's no political party affiliation in data or ethnic data in here. There's no way to use these reports as they come from ERIC to in any way target a particular demographic, a particular political party. They are simply a list of names and addresses from the DMV file of individuals who do not appear to be on the voter file. When a member receives it, they filter out individuals they know not to be eligible. And I know this is a particular challenge in Florida, but in other states and in Florida, for example, they would filter out known ineligible felons, but it could be others who they know are not eligible. If they have a data set of individuals who've been declared mentally incompetent or adjudicated ineligible to vote due to mental incompetency, they could remove them. So whatever data set states have available to them of individuals that may not be eligible, they can identify and filter them out. They can also do other things to make this report a little more efficient and easier to process. If they've got multiple individuals, for example, listed under the same address, of course, they should check to make sure that address is a valid residence and not an address that isn't eligible for voter registration. But they could household that mailing and just send it. Say you've got 2 adults at a house or 3 adults at a house that aren't registered. So there's lots of ways to make this mailing more efficient and reduce the cost of it, improve and ensure that you're only mailing to individuals who should be receiving it. And then again, these mailings should clearly state the eligibility requirements, particularly around citizenship, age, and residency. Those are the primary eligibility requirements. And then at the bottom of that slide, you can see that in 2020, Florida's first EBU, we identified almost 2.41 million individuals, Floridians who were not registered to vote but appeared to be eligible. The state conducted that mailing, mailed out the postcards to those individuals. Then in 2022, we identified as required, we prepared the report for them, almost 600,000 individuals who are not registered to vote, but the Department of State opted to not download and use that report, which ultimately led, I think, in part to their decision to leave and some of the other, many issues that we've been dealing with in the last 6 months or so here at ERIC. So I'm going to talk and sort of wrap it up here by just focusing on the ways that we protect the data, and then I'm of course happy to answer questions. So our members and ERIC must follow federal data handling laws and regulations that protect the data. And there are a whole set of data protection laws, federal data laws, as well as some state laws that protect these data, the reports that we provide. I talked about the DMV data. It's protected by something called the Driver's Privacy Protection Act, federal law. The limited access death master file data, the death data, is protected by a set of regulations and other federal laws. And then the NCOA data is protected by licensing agreements that are predicated on old privacy laws. So both ERIC and its members must adhere to these laws when addressing and dealing and managing requests for the data. We both, ERIC as an organization and its members, have a duty to report unauthorized disclosure of the data. And then moving over to the cyber sort of approach, we take what's called a standards-based risk management approach to protecting the data. This means that we have developed and adopted an information security management plan, comprehensive plan, risk assessment tools, and a whole set of policies and procedures all built around recommendations and international standards and the ISO standards. And we review those annually, internally, propose changes. Those changes go to our board of directors who must review and approve them. We also subject ourselves to external reviews. In 2020, we had a comprehensive cybersecurity assessment done by a third party that looked at they did a vulnerability scan, penetration testing, social engineering. In other words, are we susceptible to phishing attacks? They looked at our overall email security. They did a policy analysis on our procedures and policies. Do we have any gaps in our information security management plan? Do we do what we say we're going to do? Very, very comprehensive review that found no material findings in how we handle and protect the data or our systems architecture. And then every 3 years, we must undergo a separate independent assessment of our handling of that Social Security death data. And this is done by an accredited entity that must review across 260 plus categories of evidence, evidence, to ensure that we are handling the Social Security death data in a manner that complies with federal data handling practices. And we are in the midst of that right now. We do that every 3 years. So we did it in 2017, 2020, and we are in the middle of that one now. We are also in the middle of our first ever SOC audit. That's an SOC, System of Controls audit. I believe it's, or Service Organization Controls, excuse me. It is sort of the gold standard for independent assessments of data handling and data security practices. So we are doing the first step in that. It's a 2-step process. You do it once to create a baseline. It's like 260 different pieces of evidence that we have to provide to this auditor, and they analyze those. And if we pass, that's great. They'll produce a report, and then it's something that you do ongoing each year after that, where they observe over time to ensure that you're complying with your policies, practices, and procedures to protect those data. And then we do have multiple layers of security, and we do adhere to best appropriate practices. So those multiple layers of security are things like that hashing application that I talked about. And I do have a slide on that, so I'll just go here and then we can move to Q&A. But this is the base layer. I described it early verbally. Here's a slide to give you sort of a visual. And this is applied again to the driver's license, social security, and date of birth. This process, this cryptographic hash is different from encryption. In encryption, you intend to go back to the original value. So there's a key to decrypt. There is no key with a cryptographic one-way hash because there's no intent to ever restore the data to its original value or what it originally looked like. So this is one layer. We have many layers. We have secure transfer of data across an SFTP, meaning when our states upload our data, only certain individuals in that state have access to that server. They don't have access to any other state's data. Only that particular computer has access to it, and then they log in with credentials that are provided by us, not that they create. Those are two more examples. Again, it's hashed. It's hashed again when we bring it inside our environment. These three data points. That's another layer. So we have multiple layers to protect the data that we use and the reports that we provide. And I'm happy to answer more questions about that or anything else I've covered here. I do see probably one in the chat. I know I went a little fast there, but I wanted to leave time for Q&A. So again, thank you for having me. And at this point, happy to go back if we need to in slides to focus on those or just leave this here and answer any questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Shane. And we move on to our Supervisor of Elections, Mike Bennett. If you could take down the screen share, Shane, that'd be
Sure.
good. Thanks.
First of all, appreciate being invited on this. The ERIC situation has caused a lot of grief in Florida. It really has. I started working on ERIC in 2011, or possibly 2012, 11 or 12 session. I met with a man by the name of David Becker, who was with the Pew Institute, and they were really pushing it. And we fought hard, real hard, to get ERIC in. We got it passed through the first phase, but we couldn't get it passed through the budget. The budget didn't happen until 2017. Unfortunately, by that time, there were a lot of negatives around the country. Louisiana, Texas was talking, several talking about pulling out. And for a variety of reasons. And the biggest one, of course, was they were, I don't know what the hell their problem was, to be honest with you, because here we were fighting so hard. Every state was fighting so hard. We wanted accurate voting rules. And then along comes the first system that can actually deliver somewhat accurate voting rules. And we decide, well, we really don't want to do that anymore because that might favor someone else. And it's kind of like vote by mail in Florida. I was always shocked that it got changed around so much when you figure that our governor won 65% of the vote down in Florida, and the majority of that was vote by mail. And so here we got a system that works. It's only in America that you can find a system that works so well, and it's time to get rid of it. But that's exactly what we did with ERIC. We have approximately every year about 20,000 people moving in, out, around, changing addresses or whatever in Manatee County, just Manatee County. And we fight really hard to keep those accurate. We have a lot of people who register to vote or try to register to vote who should not be registering to vote. But it's not that they want to commit fraud. It's really not. A lot of it is under social pressure. All of a sudden, you find a new couple that moved down here. Shane and his wife just moved down here from Michigan, and they go to the local church, and the local church is pushing this new school referendum. And they said, "Man, are you registered to vote?" And Shane says, "No, we're not." And they say, "Oh, you got to sign up right here. We'll get it done." And they fill out the paperwork. The problem with it is Shane's trying to change his life. See, he's a convicted felon from Minnesota or Michigan, and he's trying to change his life, and he's trying to protect a reputation. So consequently, they take the pressure from the church group and register, even though they know they're never going to vote. They're not going to commit fraud. They're really not. In the 11, 12 years that I've been associated with the supervised elections in Manatee County, we've actually only pushed 3 people to get prosecuted. And most of those, to be honest with you, the state's attorney's office doesn't want to do anything about them, and so they kind of get lost in the shuffle. Fraud is not a big problem, certainly not in Manatee County. Is fraud an issue in some of the other areas? Yeah. Do we have people who left Iowa and are still on the voting rolls up there and they moved to Florida? Yes, we do. And ERIC was really about the only system that we had that could follow up and try to correct that. And it's really a shame that the state of Florida decided not to participate anymore. And I guess that, I might have more of a personal situation with it since I fought so hard to get it through when I was in the Senate. And to lose that was really disappointing. But I think most of it has been explained. I don't think I need to go into any more detail of what ERIC does and how it's protected. The ERIC system did a wonderful job, and it certainly helped us with the 27,000 people who move in and out of Manatee County and change addresses and all that. And it's really a shame, the only system we had in the country that was doing anything as far as protecting that. I don't know how many listeners we have on this Zoom call this morning, but I'm just about willing to bet that not a single one of you walked into whatever state you were leaving and moved to Florida and walked in when you left Iowa, Minnesota, Nebraska, wherever it was, and said, take me off the voting rolls, I'm going to go to Florida. You didn't do it. And guess what? I didn't either. Okay. And so we do have a lot of duplicate. The surprising part is how few of those actually try to vote in most places. Where the confusion comes up is I have a home in North Carolina. And so am I a resident of North Carolina, or am I a resident down here? Am I voting down here? Am I voting up there? And every once in a while, people do get older and do get forgetful and are well, somebody sent me a ballot, so I guess I can vote for it. It would shock you the number of times, like in the last election, in the presidential election in 2022, how many ballots we got back from the 2018 election. People have been having to sit on them that long. That's not fraud, okay? I just don't believe that we've got that problem, especially when we had the ERIC system that really helped. But that's really where we're at. I'll be happy to answer any questions about Manatee County. Our staff here is so unbelievably competent of watching all of this and going through those. We just really don't face those issues. We're not Miami, we're not Orange County, we're not Hillsborough, we're just little Manatee County. So take your questions.
Thank you, Mike. So Judy, would you unmute yourself, and do we have questions in chat?
We have lots of good questions in chat. The first one says, I don't know if Shane will address this, but it would be interesting to know whether ERIC has a relationship with DHS and possible support with cybersecurity that could benefit local and state election authorities. If Florida is not part of ERIC, does that cut us off from technical and cybersecurity expertise and processes?
So it does not cut Florida off. In fact, the state and the counties can get support directly from the cybersecurity infrastructure agency within DHS. And Mike, I don't know if you want to speak to this. I don't know what Manatee County is doing, what level of services or you may have received or are receiving from them. But no, being a member of ERIC does not in any way affect a state or local's ability to get services and support from Homeland Security.
These next two I'm going to combine. It said, when ERIC had the most number of states, how many did ERIC have? And how many other organizations like ERIC exist?
So at our peak last summer, we had 34 members. 34. And so we've lost 9 states. We have this sort of long drawn out resignation period, so it makes counting a little tricky, but we've lost 9, and that includes Texas, who's technically a member right now for about another 6 weeks.
Okay.
And then the other part of the question was, is there another system like ERIC? There is no other system like ERIC that provides the breadth of reports that we provide, that is run and controlled by election officials. You may have read something about Eagle AI. This is a tool, a service, if you will, that is being promoted by certain individuals. It is unclear to me how it works or how well it works. I've read a number of articles on it. It appears to be a tool that would allow sort of everyday citizens to use open source data, public data to identify potentially duplicate registrations and then submit those registrations to their local election officials sort of in mass as voter registration challenges. That is not the same as what ERIC does. There are other tools out there that are apparently in development. You can find them if you research, search the news on this, but there is nothing I have seen yet is anything near what ERIC is or does what ERIC does, and certainly does not have the same public policy benefits ERIC in terms of being in control of election officials, funded by election officials, etc.
It's a question for both of you or each of you to answer, which I'm sure has been in the back of everybody's mind. I'd like to know why Florida canceled its membership.
It's easy. Politics. Unfortunately, politics too many times overrides things. It's like when they passed Senate Bill 750 last year. You would have thought they would have talked to the supervisors of elections of how was this going to affect our elections? How was it going to affect our voter registration? How was it going to affect the number of people registered to vote by mail? They didn't. They didn't ask us. They didn't invite us to the dance. And it's really a shame. And one of the things that the league can do for me is in the last presidential election, we had approximately 120,000 people registered to vote by mail. When that law passed, okay, everybody's got to re-up. And if they don't re-up, they're not going to vote by mail. We only have about 7,000 out of the 120,000 who have selected to do this. I would hope that everybody, when they get off of this phone call today, calls my office today and requests vote by mail. Whether you use it or not, it's an insurance policy that no matter what happens, you'll be able to vote. But, when they look at those things, they should have never walked away from ERIC. What they should have done is participated to make it better. And I don't necessarily am here today to talk about things that could have been better with ERIC, but I know that if they would have got the approval or the input from the states that did get out, we could have had a system that is better, and it would have been better for everybody in the country.
As a follow-up to that, then, let's see the question again. Will you advocate for the state's Association of Supervisors to lobby to see if there's a possibility of rejoining ERIC?
The state association probably will not take up that as an organization. We're very careful what we do. We do look at legislation collectively of things that might change it, but I do not see that that's on the agenda for this year. It could, but I don't believe that we're going to be having that at the head of our list this year.
Okay. And what is the one-time membership fee and what's the annual fee to join ERIC, Mr. Hamlin?
I think Shane can probably tell you that better than I can.
Yeah.
Okay.
So the one-time fee is $25,000, and the dues are based on the citizen voting age population of the state and the number of states in ERIC. And I believe Florida's dues were around 100,000 a year when they left.
Of course, that if Florida wanted to join again, would we have to pay the initiation fee again?
I don't think so.
I don't think so either.
Yeah,
Okay.
Not the way the bylaws are currently written.
I don't know, Shane. I think when I first started looking at it back in 11 or 12, they were willing to waive the initiation fee if I could convince Florida to do it. And
Yeah.
I came really close to pulling it off, but
Mhm.
can't win them all.
Yeah, no.
So also being that the percentage of fraud was so very low, why wasn't this report more prevalent and the data released for more accurate reporting?
Which data? Sorry.
That was the question. It
Okay.
says, yeah,
Okay, they might be referring to that voter participation report.
right.
So I had wanted to share some numbers from the 2020, Florida's 2020 experience with that report. But when I looked back in our system today, I could see, or in our files today, or this weekend, I could see that we are still waiting actually for some updates from the Department of State. So I don't have the final disposition on the number of possible cases we identified, and I'm reluctant to share the overall because
Okay.
many of them are eliminated as administrative errors. So it's
And
a
here's
very
another
low
question.
number.
Okay. Shane, here's another question for you. How does Eric obtain info from DMV? Is it info gathered from states that are only members?
Yes, only member states. We only get DMV data from member states. The data is usually prepared by the DMV. Sometimes it's hashed by the DMV and sent directly to us. Sometimes it's sent to the election official and the election official sends it to us. Regardless, it all passes through secure channels with that layer of that cryptographic hash I talked about, as well as general encryption through that secure server that I talked about.
Question from Liv says, within about the last month, registered Democrats have lost about 10% of active registered voters. Republicans lost about 4 to 5% of active registered voters, and NPA category also fell dramatically. If it's not attributable to Eric, how is Manatee losing so many active registered voters from the roll in such a short time?
You know, percentage wise, it hasn't really changed. It hasn't changed. But when you're looking at those rolls, we have people who are no longer requesting, say, vote by mail, or they have moved out, or they had fraudulent registrations, or they tried to. So sometimes those voter rolls, when we do an update, and I think the last one, and I don't have it in front of me, it was just a couple months ago, and I don't believe that we're losing those voters. I think if you'll go through those numbers again.
And I mean, obviously I can't speak to Manatee County, but generally in an odd numbered year prior to a presidential election year, and particularly the odd numbered year following one, states are acting on their legal duty and obligation to remove those inactive voters who have been through, where it's been 2 federal general elections. So typically there's a large number of registrations that are canceled following a presidential election because that's the second one in that 4-year 2 federal election cycle. But there's also a lot of list maintenance done on the front end going into a presidential year where states are removing individuals who they can remove under the law to ensure their roles are as accurate as possible heading into the presidential election year.
We're just about out of time. And I'd thank you, Judy, for fielding those questions. And thank you both, Shane and Mike, for really enlightening and thought-provoking presentation. We encourage all of you to share this video of the presentation, which will be posted for sure by tomorrow, probably today. And the link will be available on our Facebook page as well.
And please tell all of your friends to register for vote by mail today.
We actually are pushing it, and I'm not sure, this whole thing of all the restrictions that we have now, you're not getting any voter registrations from the League of Women Voters. And so our postage is going through the roof because we're handing everybody envelopes and stamps. So we have the same issue with the register vote by mail. Is we would like to go into some of the senior facilities and group homes and help them register. But we would have to give every person there a separate envelope and stamp.
Believe me, I know.
Yeah, so it gets it gets really tough. Hard times to really encourage voting, and that's.
I'm off to the next one. You all have a wonderful day.
Thanks.
Take care.
Thanks.
Take care, Shane.
Thank you.
Thanks. And please contact your state legislators and governor if you support re-entry into ERIC. Our league has some excellent programs coming up that we hope you will join. On Thursday, September 28th at 5:30, we have our bi-monthly Taste of the League. And this time we have young adults. So we've got our interns, we've got successful young adult clubs that have been started, league affiliated. Our next hot topics is October 9th at noon, and we have a panel discussion of victims of sexual exploitation. Thank you for joining us today, and if you have not already done so, please join the league. So thank you.